Here's a psychology fact you're probably not ready for. If you don't obsess over sports, your brain is wired differently from most people. And that difference doesn't just affect what you watch on TV. It affects how you bond with people, how you build identity, how you find meaning, and why at some point in your life you probably felt slightly out of sync with everyone else. Now, before anyone gets defensive, this is not an anti-sports video. Sports are powerful. Sports are emotional. Sports work. But the real question is this. Why do some people feel absolutely nothing when everyone else is emotionally invested? Why do some people hear screaming, chanting, and celebration and feel disconnected instead of excited? Psychologists call this alternative reward wiring. And once you understand it, a lot of things about yourself or someone you know start to make sense. Because this isn't about being smarter. It's not about being better. And it's definitely not about being boring. It's about how your brain decides what's worth emotional investment. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. This difference comes with a cost. Because we live in a culture that bonds through shared obsession. And sports are one of the strongest bonding tools humans have ever created. So if you don't plug into that system, you stand out, whether you want to or not. The truth most people avoid. Here's the harsh psychological truth. People who don't obsess over sports usually don't get dopamine from group identity, and that makes you an outsider in a world built on tribes. Sports are not just games. They are modern-day tribal rituals, colors, logos, chants, rivals, loyalty, shared enemies, shared victories. Your brain doesn't see a game. It sees belonging. That's why people say we won, even though they never touch the field. That's why losses feel personal. That's why fandom gets emotional, defensive, and sometimes aggressive. Because psychologically, it's not entertainment. It's identity reinforcement. But if you don't obsess over sports, your brain doesn't attach identity to external groups in the same way. And here's the part nobody likes to admit. That makes you harder to emotionally program. Why your brain doesn't care. Sports trigger dopamine through anticipation, uncertainty, competition, and emotional swings. But dopamine doesn't come from what you're doing. It comes from what your brain values. And your brain values something else. The people who don't obsess over sports often get stimulation from ideas, creativity, mastery, personal progress, depth instead of hype, understanding instead of cheering. Your mind quietly asks a question most people never stop to think about. Why would I emotionally invest in something I don't control? And that question alone separates you from the majority. Because most people don't choose what excites them, their brains do it automatically. Yours doesn't. Yours evaluates. The identity difference. For many sports fans, identity is external. Team loyalty becomes a personality shortcut, a social signal, a built-in conversation starter, a sense of belonging without introspection. You don't need to explain who you are. Your team does it for you. But people who don't obsess over sports tend to build identity internally. Their sense of self comes from what they're learning, what they're building, what they value, what they're becoming. So when a team wins or loses, nothing inside you shifts, no ego boost, no emotional crash. And to people who do tie identity to teams, that looks cold, detached, even arrogant. But psychologically, it's independence. Here's where it gets even worse, because this difference doesn't just affect entertainment. It affects your social experience. If you don't care about sports, you've probably been here before. You're in a group setting. The conversation shifts to a game. Energy spikes, everyone is animated, and you feel invisible. You nod, you smile, you fake reactions. You say things like, "Yeah, that was crazy." "Oh wow, I didn't see that coming." "No way, that ref was blind." Even though you have no emotional attachment whatsoever. And at some point you've probably wondered, well, what's wrong with me? Nothing. But psychology says this. People with internal reward systems often feel disconnected before they feel confident. Time feels different to you. This also explains something else. Why watching a 3-hour game feels exhausting instead of exciting. To a sports fan, that time feels rich with meaning, emotion, tension, release. To you, it feels empty because your brain is constantly asking, what am I gaining? What am I learning? What am I building? And if the answer is nothing, your interest shuts off. It's not boredom, it's selective. Attention. Your brain is stingy with focus, and focus is one of the most valuable cognitive resources there is. The tribal thinking gap. Sports thrive on us versus them, but people who don't obsess over sports tend to score lower in tribal thinking. They're less emotionally reactive to group loyalty, less interested in symbolic wins, less driven by collective validation. They don't need an enemy to feel united. They don't need a crowd to feel alive. Instead, they ask, does this actually matter? Does this improve my life? Is this real or just noise? And that mindset creates friction, because society is built for people who blend, not for people who question. The loneliness phase. Here's something nobody prepares you for. If you don't plug into mainstream obsessions, there's often a loneliness phase. Not because you're antisocial, not because you dislike people, not because you think you're superior, but because shared obsession is the fastest social glue humans have. When you opt out, connection takes longer. It becomes deeper but rarer. And during that gap, self-doubt creeps in. You start wondering if you should force yourself to care, if you're missing out, if you're doing life wrong. You're not. You're just not wired for surface-level bonding. The part that should wake you up. Here's the truth most people never confront. Fitting in has never been your primary motivator. And that's not a flaw. That's a warning label. People who don't obsess over what everyone else obsesses over are harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to emotionally hijack. But they also have to build meaning manually. No default settings, no pre-installed passions, and that responsibility scares people. The reframe that changes everything. So here's the psychological shift that actually matters. Stop measuring yourself by mainstream interests. Stop asking, why don't I care about what everyone else cares about? Start asking those days, what does my brain respond to deeply and why? Because people like you aren't designed for collective obsession. You're designed for depth, and depth always looks strange in a world addicted to noise. If this video hits you, it's probably because you've always felt slightly out of place but never understood why. You're not broken, you're not boring, and you're definitely not missing something fundamental. You're just wired to invest emotionally where it actually matters to you. And once you stop apologizing for that, everything gets quieter, clearer, and more intentional. If you relate, comment what you actually obsess over instead. And if you want more psychology that explains why you've always felt different, subscribe. You're not behind. You're just playing a different game.